I was hesitating to accept or to deny, but finally I accepted.
Mensonge.
Those South American.
On a des noms de
Yeah, they come from
Tam kapatsınlar ya. Prazer. De onde você era, Brasil?
Como?
De onde você era, Brasil?
Ah, você fala português? Ah, eu queria praticar mais espanhol. Eu sou do Rio de Janeiro. Ah, você é da onde?
É, Rosário.
Ah, Rosário.
Não?
Rosário já. Hablas um pouco de português? Hablas bem português? Sim, sim. Mas você viveu no Brasil?
Não. Mas fui muito daí do Isaac.
Estudou 10 anos?
Other, like so many Brazilians in the studying medicine.
Ah, você está estudando medicina?
Não, conheço.
Ah,
Minha cidade muito
muita gente foi para o
tem
Brasil.
muito brasileiro lá.
E você está se fazendo?
Da junho.
Ah, você acabou de chegar. Você trabalha onde? Ah, no programa do Erasmus. Em seu escritório, você tem que continuar.
Switching brain play.
Your office is here.
Yes, but that is the French language. French. It still works in yeah.
And what is this moment?
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience, distinguished speakers, thank you very much for the organizer of this event. So it's my responsibility to be moderator of this panel dedicated to a discussion on the expansion of future complex domains. We will have 4 presentations. But before starting, just slight changes in the program. The first one is that we will postpone the coffee break after the closing remarks in order not to have a break that is not really needed if after the panel and the closing remarks that will not last very long, as you can read on the program. But still a coffee break will be, that will have coffee afterwards, but it will not be a break, it will be a closing coffee, I would say. And the second change is that Professor Christopher Coker accepted to make closing remarks instead of Professor Kahn, could not be here today. So now we can start with the panel itself. Because of the use of presentation, I will just very briefly present the four panelists, and then we will move to the chair in order to enable everybody to see the screen. So the first panelist will be Professor Raffaele Marchetti. She's already sitting over there. From the School of Government of Louis. The second one will be Professor Paul Gardner, here on my left, from the American University of Paris. And the third one will be Professor Sigurd Turk, here on my far left, from the Martin Center Academic Council and University of Ljubljana. And finally, Professor Jonker from the Delft University of Technology and Leiden University. Thank you very much for being with us. And so, without further discussion, I give the floor to Professor Raffaele Marchetti, who will speak about the role of non-state actors in the future of global governance and international security. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair, and thanks very much for the invitation. I mean, the first session was very interesting, and I hope I give my contribution to the second one to make it equally interesting. I see two main dynamics at the international level. The great power dynamic, state-centered, we discussed this in the first panel. And then there is a second dynamic that we can call global governance, which is much more pluralist, in which, of course, states are important and great powers are, of course, important. But there is a plethora of different actors that are equally significant and relevant. And my feeling is that if we don't understand well their sort of actions in the wider international system, we would fail to capture the real sort of dynamics there. So I'm going to talk about this second level. I'm going to talk about non-state actors, and rather, more specifically, I'm going to talk about how non-state actors engage and create synergy and partnership with governments and with intergovernmental institutions, because I think it is precisely in their synergy where the action is. And so, not talking about networks in general or singly, as was a bit mentioned in the Q&A in the first session, but looking at these actors in their engagement with states and governments, okay? And second, I'm going to talk in a more comprehensive way. I'm not only going to talk about the goodies, but goodies and baddies, and well, the two things are controversial. But before that, let me give you my 2 cents to the previous discussion, diverting a bit from the topic. But going back to the discussion in the first panel, I have to say that, yes, of course, I do see also a great sort of power dynamics there, and this dynamics is shaped fundamentally by 4 great powers, which is, of course, US and China, but then also Russia and the EU, where if we want to develop a strategic reflection about this, obviously the relationship between US and China is central. But it is equally important to look at the positioning of EU and Russia with one or the other. It seems to me that we need to look at how these 2 other actors sort of align themselves with one or the other to understand strategically in the mid-long term what is going to happen in international affairs. I mean, it's clearly that one scenario is the 2-block scenario, the kind of new polarism that we are witnessing today. But then there are other 2 scenarios which are hypothetical, granted, I mean, it's not for today, but these, we should not, I think, underestimate them, and we should take them into consideration if we want to develop a strategic thinking. And one scenario, obviously, is that Russia goes back into Europe with EU and China, and US and China remain restricted and isolated. But equally, the other scenario is that the EU and Russia slide into this Eurasian integration project, and the American goes adrift in this American solitude that some commentators talk about. of course, these are hypothetical scenarios, but very clearly, I mean, we can see them. And I think if we take this kind of strategic perspective, I wonder whether it's really wise to push Russia in the hands of China. It seems to me a tactical but a very bad strategic choice. And it's not only a matter of inclusion, but it's rather precisely strategic sort of thinking about the mid-level. Anyway, let me move back to my original topic, that is non-state actors. And I hope with this I will clarify some of my sort of preliminary comments. It is clear that the politics in our age is much more complex than in previous times. There are states, but then there is a plethora of different actors, international gatherings, terrorist groups, philanthropic foundations, think about Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, social movements, international NGOs, national diasporas, alternative media, WikiLeaks, singers, think tanks, as this one that invited us here, banks, and big financial actors, rating agencies, global media players, new media, cities, regions. Non-state actors are everywhere in global politics, and the system has become much more intricate. To have political control of this situation, we need to develop and to understand complex dynamics that develop in multiple dimensions, levels, locations. We need to have an advanced understanding of the international system. And to this extent, I mean, to this goal, I try to elaborate on a few mechanisms, micro mechanisms that I think are important to understand the system in which we live. And these mechanisms are sort of shaped and sort of characterized by a common characteristics, that is the idea of hybrid politics, of the sort of coalescing and integration between governmental and non-governmental action, and that bringing in itself both a lot of opportunities and potential benefits, but equally many risks and a lot of potential costs. So this is the kind of context in which we live. I don't think we can go back. I don't think it would be very naive to think about the ability to go back to compartmentalized systems. This is not the system in which we live, and this cannot be changed. So this is the context in which we play. I suggest that we understand it well in order to avoid the costs and to get the benefits. In this system, in which, of course, there are many actors, what is important is to understand that none has overwhelming power over the other, which implies that each needs the other to further its objective. Even the greatest power needs to engage positively with non-state actors. And here I include, as I said, many different actors. Think about, I mean, from NGOs to tech companies, I mean, and the different dimensions. So of course, security is one important. You need to be able and skillful enough to engage with them properly. There are many different actors. Of course, multinational and profit-oriented actors are an important component of that. There are non-governmental actors, NGOs classically important, local authorities, but also private or hybrid organizations, the so-called standard-setting bodies. And this idea of sort of generating and spreading standards in global governance, it's so important that we cannot really overlook that. And it's clear, if we look at from a quantitative perspective, that the sheer number of these actors has increased very significantly in the last few decades, together with the development of the so-called globalization. Okay, and they have acquired, and they are now playing many different functions, performing functions that were sort of carried out originally by governments, by public authorities. They bring new issues to the agenda, to the public agenda. They lobby policymakers. They offer technical assistance. They provide funds for both private and public players. they formulate regulatory decisions, they implement program and public policies, they provide services, they monitor the respect of international agreements, they resolve disputes, they facilitate conflict resolutions, they also help implementing decisions, so-called enforcement, in different policy domains. Non-state actors do not always operate alone to pursue those objectives. Increasingly, international institutions and national governments are developing forms of cooperation with them. Of course, they have different goals. I mean, governments have a different agenda, but they find in practice an overlapping sort of grounds to develop a political convergence or a tactical convergence to develop and to pursue similar sort of short-term goals. At the international level, the solution to such complexity was found in the so-called multi-stakeholder initiatives based on spontaneous collaboration, participation through ownership, power sharing, better potential for learning, and finally common action. But it is not only at the international institution level that this kind of cooperation is taking place. I was talking with a colleague today that also most traditional state-centric organizations like NATO are engaged and strive to develop a much better cooperation with NGOs. But then it's not only about international organizations, it's also governments who are engaging more and more with non-state actors. Public diplomacy is by now a common term in international affairs. And it's the idea of governments engaging with citizens of other countries directly or indirectly by engaging with NGOs in that country. Foreign policy by proxy was a common practice during the Cold War. Washington and Moscow used it intensively, if covertly. With the fall of the wall, this modality was relaunched in the mid-90s by the US during the Clinton presidency, with the sort of reform of the US aid. In time, this practice intensified and spread also to other democratic powers. The EU is a case in point, actually following the same kind of practice of the US, only with a time gap. If you think about the creation after 20 years of the European Endowment for Democracy, precisely trying to mimic the National Endowment for Democracy, it's very clear. But there are two consequences. There's been two consequences to this kind of spread of this modality of carrying out foreign policy through the engagement, or by proxy, through the engagement with other actors. The first reaction, the first consequence, was the backlash, with many resident governments passing laws against foreign-funded NGOs, as they acknowledge the increasing influence of these actors under the governmental screen. First. And second consequence is that those who were passive receivers of this kind of public diplomacy have learned a lesson. And so now we see basically all major powers developing these kind of activities. It's not anymore a matter of American and European democracy promotion or foreign policy by engaging with NGOs, but Russia, China, Iran, Qatar, and so many other actors are now actively engaged in developing their foreign policy through the collaboration and the synergy with non-state actors. And these transnational dynamics are here to stay. Goods and money, but also ideas, people, political support, and weapons, they all cross national boundaries, though none of them with 100% legitimacy. We are in a transition period, which has intensified in the last 30 years, but we don't have clear political guidelines on how to handle this. These new forms of transnational politics by proxy generate intense debate. All major actors practice it. All major actors denounce it. And it's thus necessary to study them in much more detail, and this is what I'm going to do here. In the remaining part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about 6 mechanisms, looking at how sort of these kind of, if you want, using a terminology from a different field, public-private partnership is developing in practice through specific mechanisms that, of course, alter the balance of power in favor of either the government or the local opposition, minorities, societal actors. It is a kind of intervening variables entering into the domestic balance of power and favoring either the government or the opposition. And it's a transnational variable. It's a kind of foreign variable intervening strongly in the domestic affairs. Now, if you still think about the word of sovereignty, of course, this is not anymore the word of sovereignty. This is a word of interdependent, if you want, already from the 70s, given in that, dynamics, in which sovereignty is by degrees. And its ability to be implemented in a kind of self-determination mood has to come to some compromise with foreign influences. And I understand this is disruptive of a certain understanding of national self-determination and sovereignty. But this is the kind of world in which we live. And again, my point is that this is common experience in all countries. More or less, of course, depending on your ability. And yet, I mean, if we look at how politics is theorized, it's very ironic, because basically, when you think, I mean, if you think about all the studies about democracy and democratization, they are almost entirely focused on the idea of a self-contained community. If you go from Plato to Rawls and all the most recent democratic theorists, you always find this idea of the island, islands in which citizens elect the government, the government reflects the interest and the preference of the citizen, and then they live happily in a democratic system. As if the rest of the world didn't exist. Now, of course, this is naive, it's a dream, and first of all, because they are not always happy, and second, because they are not isolated. No man is an island, as somebody said. This is the case. No community is an island in the world in which we live. Not even the most sort of segregated society is as, I don't know if you can think about North Korea. So what's happened? Well, it happened that there is a government, a majority or a minority if the government is an authoritarian government, and then there is an opposition of some sort. And both will try to take advantage of the opportunities provided from foreign actors. Beyond, of course, trying to sort of winning the game at the national level. There are different mechanisms that can be identified in this kind of dynamic. One classical mechanism which was identified more than 20 years ago by 2 American scholars, Keck and Sicking, is called the boomerang effect. It's a kind of liberal, rosy understanding in which you have a minority in an undemocratic country. What you might think about, I don't know, women's under the Taliban in Afghanistan, and what do? Well, they have resources outside. They can go and ask for support from Amnesty, from the European Union, from friendly governments, and by circumventing the barriers that prevent them to have a voice in public decision-making at the national level, by circumventing these barriers and sort of by the backing of international actors, they can put pressure on the government to dismantle the barriers. Okay, so through this kind of boomerang effect, you know, the Australian thing, they can empower and increase their pressure, their leverages, by sort of taking advantage of international sort of opportunities. But of course, it's not only an inside out, it's also outside in. It is also foreign non-state actors, foreign NGOs, foreign governments, foreign international organizations who will rely on local actors, local opposition, local minorities, to push their political agenda. Okay. Think about EU democracy promotion. I mean, the EU engages with NGOs in other countries to promote a certain agenda based, for instance, on the EU sort of conception of human rights, including death penalty, including other kinds of human rights, which are not always entirely recognized by other countries, even democratic countries. Is that all? No, of course. I mean, of course, this can get a bit darker and a bit unclear. Foreign governments can rely also on local military actors, local rebel groups, militias to bring on their interests, and of course on cyber organizations. According to cyber operation tracks, there are almost 20 countries that have used these kind of proxies for their foreign policy objectives almost 200 times in the last decade. But of course also the government will, if clever enough and smart, will rely on foreign opportunities. So the government, in order to smash and criminalize and sometimes even kill the opposition, will rely on like-minded governments and like-minded foreign NGOs or foreign groups to put increased pressure on local minorities or oppositions. And this is also very common. Think about the Syria case, in which the government, Bashar, brought in governments, but also foreign non-state actors to pursue its own domestic objectives. This is not only bilateral and bidirectional, but of course there is always a scale shift. The moment you bring in foreign actors supporting local opposition and foreign actors supporting local governments will enter into political competition themselves, in a way scaling up the entire dynamic. They will not act alone, but they will act in networks, because you don't only rely on one single NGO, but that single NGO often is part of an international network or maybe a transnational campaign. So by bringing one NGO, you bring an entire network of group of NGOs on your side, or on the other side, from the government side. And then of course, we shouldn't forget that most of these activities, or some of these activities, are carried out in a covert fashion. Governments rely, and opposition relies on this kind of support very often in a secret way. So I think we need to focus on this kind of mechanism if we want to understand, if you want the other side of that kind of great power dynamics that we were discussing in the first session. Yes, of course, there is that kind of great power dynamics, or if you want, in the state dynamic, but then this dynamic is very often carried out in conjunction or in partnership with non-state actors. On one side, the minority opposition, and on the other side, the government. And so, of course, the system is very complex, but I think it's a challenge for political leaders and political scientists to have a better understanding of these dynamics, both in empirical terms, but also in normative terms. As I said, this is an issue that enters into collision with our traditional understanding of national self-determination and sovereignty. And again, it's an issue that brings risks and opportunities. So for me, this is of the utmost, the most important significance if we want to understand our, if we want to improve our understanding of the international system. And with this, I stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Marchetti. The next panelist will be Professor Gardner from the American University of Paris. He will speak about the return of the political warfare.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Is my PowerPoint working, or is it not going to happen? Okay. I will compliment, I hope, the previous speaker. I believe I have I will be talking more about the covert aspects of the manipulation of anti-state actors, and I make a distinction between anti-state actors and NGOs, because anti-state actors are those who are militantly opposed to a specific state, or states. And I really don't like Al-Qaeda referred as an NGO. It just never made sense to me, and I see it in almost every textbook. So I react against that. However, I will talk about this. So this is called The Return of Political Warfare. Is a critique of what I think was happening now, from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period. Which button do I push here? Do I name it? So, all right, I don't know how to use it. I'm not very technical. What do I have to name? It was working. I probably turned it off. So what I'll be doing here is talking a bit about hybrid warfare, moving from more traditional covert. Oh, okay. I don't want to get too much into details, but my main point is Clausewitz is usually misinterpreted. He is war of continuation of politics by other means is the cliche. If you look at what he says later on war, it's the war is nothing but the continuation of political intercourse or political communications, politischen Verkehrs, with the intervention of other means. And in order to assert at the same time that this political intercourse is not stopped by the war itself. In other words, he's seeing war as continual diplomacy. It is not simply something that you do in order to just defeat the enemy. There's a dialogue going on even in the middle of war. Next.
Words.
Oh, words. Where do I push though?
And the next one.
Right one? Oh, this one. Sorry. Yeah, I really. Oh, there you go. Okay. Okay. I'm just maybe I'm not doing it. Okay. So I've already said this. A dilemma is that opponent is capable of fighting back once the war starts, and then if compromises can be made, one or two more sides may be drawn. So the point is this political interaction, engaging in looking for compromises over time, or pushing your own will to its advancement. So his famous Trinity. First, the blind natural force of violence. Second, interaction of chance, probability, uncertainty. And the main point I'm making here is war's rational subordination to the policy of the government, which may change. That policy may change in the course of the conflict and in interaction with the opponent's actions and policies. So you set up a strategy, but you may not be able to actually achieve that strategy depending on the outcome and depending on the interaction with the opponent. The diplomacy must adapt itself to the chosen means, a process that can radically change that strategy. So the key point here is when we move from political warfare, which I'll leave to George Kennan in just a second, to hybrid warfare is undermining that fundamental dictum that political communications and diplomacy must not be stopped by the war itself. Right out of Clausewitz. But we are engaging in a point where we're no longer, our war is acting in such a way that we're no longer engaging in political communications with Russia, or even to a certain extent with China. We're beginning to communicate with North Korea, but I'm afraid there are other issues there, right? So, and such warfare purposely, the problem with hybrid warfare as it's developed, and I'll talk about that in a second, purposely augments the elements of uncertainty and thus makes it even more difficult to bring the conflict under rational control for political or diplomatic ends. And the last point is that anti-state tactics of the post-2001 global war on terrorism are beginning to be adopted by the major powers. But those major power rivalries are beginning to merge with the global war on terrorism, thereby opening the door to wider conflicts, if not major power war. There was a question earlier about the war on terrorism. It's a disaster. It's a disaster. It's costing us trillions of dollars. It starts in Afghanistan. It spreads to Iraq. It spreads to North Africa. It is spreading to Afghanistan again. It is a disaster. And to even think that it's going to end is another issue. But the problem is it's merging with the greater power rivalries with China, for example, in Xinjiang province, or Russia, the Caucasus, and other areas of Central Asia, and Syria. Okay. So, George Kennan was the founder, you can argue he started the concept of political warfare from the logical consequence of Clausewitz's doctrine in time of peace. Now, he's defined it in the Cold War terms that we use political warfare in a time of peace. Political warfare is employment of all means at a nation's command, short of war, to achieve its national directives. Such operations are both overt and covert. They're alliances, they're the Marshall Plan, they're the white propaganda and black propaganda and covert operations. Now, my concept is strategic leveraging. It just draws on this and basically the same concept, simply that I tried to systematize it, and the computer made a nice little diagram there, so I stole it. So the strategic alliances, military, technology, financial, political, economic, etc., media, propagandistic, all are tools that states can use to assert their interests. But they can expand, sustain, or even retract their interests. There's no necessity to always expand, as the traditional realist says. And then, depending on the nature of these interactions and negotiated compromises, will determine whether we maintain a global equipoise or enter into a new period of conflict. There. Now, what's interesting here is how Kennan himself argued that the British Empire had survived because of political warfare. Lenin had synthesized Marx and Clausewitz. And the U.S. up at that time had been reluctant to engage in political warfare, but was beginning to think about it in more realistic terms, overcoming this artificial division between peace and war. As I said, we're in a period of peace, but it's a continuation of war by other means. Okay. And what was new was the covert aspects of the warfare. Now, what's interesting is how he synthesizes anti-state movements with major power movements. On the one hand, the British Empire and the Soviet Union are two examples of political warfare, but he mentions the communist Abraham Lincoln Brigade and in the Spanish Civil War, and this is his quote, illegal Zionist activities in Israel and elsewhere. And these would provide the models for organized U.S. public supported resistance of tyranny in foreign countries to further national interests, American national interests. Okay, and then he proposed a director of political warfare. Now, he went on to, now we jump ahead, we call what I call strategic levering or new forms of political warfare. We find the U.S. beginning to engage in a strategy of containment, forging a NATO, Japanese, Chinese, Saudi encirclement towards the end of the Cold War. We'll come back to that in a minute in the post-Cold War period, because China is no longer in that equation. But as the United States reached out to China in the late 70s, the Soviet Union started screaming encirclement. The United States supported solidarity. The United States supported the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. You can go down the list of movements. Religion was an important tool of strategic leveraging. Afghan and Islamic resistance in Afghanistan, recognition of the Vatican in 1984, Jewish refuseniks and Christian fundamentalists inside the Soviet Union. All these were there to undermine atheist Soviet ideology. This was coupled with a strategy of horizontal escalation, which was argued we could counter Soviet advances since the Vietnam War, the so-called geopolitical gains in countries like Nicaragua or Mozambique or others, even though with our forward nuclear deployments, and that's where we get the problem today. Strategic strategy of horizontal escalation argued it was possible to counter Soviet geopolitical gains with the development of a nuclear first strike capability combined with forward weapons deployments, including the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe to counter Soviet intermediate range SS-20s, coupled with the threat of stealth and Star Wars, the two systems that the United States was going to develop at that time, but hadn't developed them, but has developed them in the present situation. So we've gone beyond the 1980s in that sense. Now, in this period of uncertainty, we came very close to make nuclear war. September 1983, the Soviets saw incorrectly reported the launch of multiple Minuteman anti-continental missiles, and the NATO Able Archer exercises November '83 also raised fears of a first strike. Now, my point is that that's part of Clausewitz's theory. This role of accident uncertainty in war is a key thing that strategists have to take into account. They can't just ignore the possibility that something could go wrong. Yeah. Okay, despite these accidents and the near accidents, we go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which came very close to missile. There were times in the Korean War in 1950, we can go down a whole list of them. The United States was able to achieve its rational objectives. The 1987 INF Accord was crucial to that, and pressed Moscow to do what the United States wanted it to do, which was withdraw its forces in Eastern Europe, undermining the Warsaw Pact, promising Gorbachev later that we would not expand NATO, getting the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, and obtaining the political goal of German unification within NATO. Now, what's interesting here, and I'm going to talk about it later, is it's not clear U.S. containment policy expected the collapse of the Soviet Union. And while ruling out the possibility of a neutral Germany, which George Kennan has supported in 1949, or even a neutral Japan, the doctrine was to keep Japan in U.S. alliance, but also to bring Germany into a full alliance in NATO. I'll talk about that in a minute. The NSC 68 doctrine came out. It was under Paul Nitze, came out of after George Kennan. It militarized containment, but it still argued the successful conduct of a policy of containment. We always leave the possibility of negotiation open. This is the point we're missing today, I think, Trump policy. Foreign economic policy. Note that in NSC 68, it says it's a way you could shape favorably to the U.S. and its welfare. It is also an instrument which, unwisely formulated and employed, could do actual harm to our national interests. That's happened. Now the point, this is why I say the United States Cold War policy at its roots in 1950 was not to undermine the Soviet Union. NSC 68, the goals did not include unconditional surrender, the subjugation of Russian peoples, or a Russia shorn of its economic potential. Such a course would irrevocably unite the Russian people behind a regime that enslaves them. Rather, these objectives contemplate Soviet acceptance of the specific and limited conditions requisite to an international environment in which they could operate. Well, my point is that NSC 68 sought to militarize containment in such a way, but still maintain communications with the Soviet Union and make geopolitical goals short of all-out war. In that situation, it remained in the Clausewitz doctrine. Immediately after the Cold War, our goal, this was talked about earlier in the previous session, was to bring a democratic Russia and other new democracies into the defense community of democratic nations so they can again become a force for peace, not only in Europe, but in other critical regions of the world. We also talked about this. The United States has consistently tried to keep the European Union from forming a larger defense integration that would undermine NATO, and particularly its integrated command structure. This is right out of the document. There were earlier variations of this document that were even stronger. That conceived Germany and Japan become hostile to the United States. Okay, so now notice this original document right after the Cold War did not envision NATO enlargement. It envisioned extending to East European states security commitments analogous to those extended in the Persian Gulf. That would have been a very different scenario. We talked about that this morning. Very different scenario had NATO taken this option rather than the later option adopted by the Clinton administration in the period from December 1994 until 97. I went back. Okay, I don't want to. We're going to go anyway. So there was no political strategy was not to extend NATO at that time until 1994. But once, what's interesting here is both George Kennan and Paul Nitze would come out against NATO enlargement by 1997, they were the founders of containment, the two. President Clinton refused to listen to any of these former highly qualified individuals to deal with this subject. That's the subject. So the point is that there were options that weren't pursued in order to say, as was spoken about, either bringing Russia into a larger community of nations, a Euro-Atlantic community. All right. But the fault line is not just with NATO. The EU would also expand without including Russia as well. So it's a double enlargement that would result in Russian alienation by 2008. All right. Now, the other point is, in the meantime, before we get to hybrid warfare, the problem is we take a highly ideological turn of democracy promotion. That starts with the support of democratic movements in Eastern Europe, the support for Boris Yeltsin, support for anti-Milosevic movements, support for color revolutions. And immediately after 2001, though, while we're supporting these democratic movements, destabilizing countries, I was in China during Tiananmen Square, I saw the crackdown. I heard Voice of America supporting the movement very strongly, and I understand why the Chinese think we're trying to undermine their society. No, I disagree with it because there was possibilities for reform if the Chinese did, under Zhao Ziyang, if the Chinese did accept it. Now, I'll skip through most of the anti-state terrorism thing, but the point is that these movements, these anti-state terrorist movements, Al-Qaeda began to be adopted into new techniques of hybrid warfare and using both discriminate and indiscriminate violence. My favorite expression is we've adopted a hit, Al-Qaeda adopted a hit but not run strategy. You destroy, who cares who dies. The idea is to create a martyrdom that will generate new followers. And obtaining strategic footholds in Palestine, Sudan, Chechnya, Afghanistan, etc. Xinjiang province, I forgot, China. All these are part of some of these Islamic goals. But there are other groups that also want to create independence movements as well. Otherwise, we'll run out of time to get to the minute. Yeah, these are just some examples of anti-state terrorism, problems with anti-state terrorism. Okay, now here, the problem is the global war of terrorism begins the merge of major power political warfare. At least not since 1999, after the war in Kosovo, and the United States, in effect, didn't overthrow Milosevic during that war. It took a movement, supported a democracy movement to try to overthrow Milosevic after the war was over. In many ways, the war solidified Milosevic's position. But the point is, U.S. political war risked the possibility that a Russia shorn of its economic potential could unite the Russian people. And this was originally because of its refusal or reluctance to draw Russia into a larger Euro-Atlantic alliance. But Russia begins its own reverse form. You mentioned that the Russians, the Iranians, have their own NGOs now. But they began to use their own techniques of democracy promotion in the 2004 election in Ukraine. They didn't win at that time. Yushchenko, the EU and US supported candidate, won, but Yanukovych would win in 2010, backed by Moscow. Furthermore, it began a more sophisticated technique of political warfare. They call it nonlinear warfare, with its seizure of Crimea and Little Green Men. Russia engaged in this what I call reverse democracy engineering to roll back the Orange Revolution, to put Yanukovych in power before the Maidan movement began to rise. And then, though, once Moscow seized the Crimea, during the instability created during that period, it uses its own form of democratization by a very hastily conceived and narrow referendum. We talked about democracy, and referendums aren't democratic. There are only two choices on that particular referendum, and usually they're yes or no questions, which are just absurd. So Moscow began to use nonlinear warfare to to counter both NATO and the EU, all different men, whether it's cyber attacks or the placing of nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad and Crimea. The idea is to destabilize and offset the West, U.S. and Europe. I'm always doing this wrong. So, I keep jumping ahead. Sorry about that. Well, there we go. So, some of this seizure of Crimea itself took place in the middle of NATO major nuclear warfare maneuvers. There was a propaganda campaign that they were going to support Russian diaspora in the Baltic states. Now the threats to deploy nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad and Crimea. Tactical nuclear weapons are seen as a means to de-escalate conflict, not to prevent conflict. Moscow's taking advantage of the fact, and here's the problem of American hegemony. America is dispersed over the globe. It doesn't mean it can control every single region. So Russia was able to pick the hole and climb out in Crimea, and it's picked a hole in Syria, and now it's beginning to integrate try to link the Crimea, Black Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean, strategically and economically. Furthermore, during the Ukrainian conflict, Moscow no longer appears to be wanting a new Russia that would link the Crimea to Odessa and Transnistria. That's certainly what was talked about at the time, at the beginning of the conflict. Those goals are too high, and I would argue that Russia can't achieve or wouldn't be able to achieve those. The cost would be too great, and occupation would be too great. The point is, Russian goals are regionally revanchist, not globally revanchist so far. The main tool of Russia is its alliance with China since 2005. We mentioned that earlier, that China did participate in the military maneuvers with Russia just recently. They've been participating in the military maneuvers in the East China Sea, in the Mediterranean, and the Baltic as well. We're almost finished. That is the idea. So I should start have some music or something. Okay, here's the key point though. In this new encirclement, China is its balancing position to prevent China from ever again becoming linked to NATO and the EU and linked to the US alliance as it did in the 1980s. And China itself doesn't want the US and Europeans, as was just mentioned, to form an alliance that could be with Russia that could be turned against China. So this is what I call a neo-Rapallo pact dating from the interwar period. The two isolated states are trying to link together to balance each other. Furthermore, an alliance with Iran, and this is why the administration, Trump's administration is focusing on Iran, because China and Russia are beginning to draw Iran into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Trump administration wants to break that. Okay. Furthermore, an unexpected consequence of this, or unexpected, but is that the Syrian diaspora helps fuel the xenophobia and nationalism in the EU, Moscow has feared a number of pan-Islamic movements would be able to take advantage of the collapse of the Assad regime. So this has solidified Moscow behind this horrendous regime. Okay, furthermore, pan-Islamic movements in Xinjiang province are being cracked down on very strongly, so that there's a new repression going on in China against the religions, religious differences. This, as I mentioned already, there's the fear of encirclement, but there's also a mutual opposition to democracy movements inside both Russia and China, and these are bringing Russia and China together as well. And this, as I said, I was in China during Tiananmen Square. The sphere of multi-party U.S. support for multi-party democracy is one of the major factors that's militarizing the Chinese Okay, we already talked about that. Sorry? Oh, yeah, 1 minute, I'll finish. That's why I'm skipping those. Okay, now here's the dilemmas. Hybrid warfare can use legal and illicit tactics and both military and non-military actions that directly impact and involve populations. It likewise involves new techniques of cyber sabotage, and certainly the accusations, proof of Russian interference in the American elections, and French elections, and others, is intensifying the animosity between the two sides that Clausewitz talks about. So animosity is growing. You can feel it in the United States. I was just back in the United States. You can feel it. Anything that's reasonably sounds like a pro-Russian sentiment, it's quite put down. So the adoption of illicit, non-conventional methods by legitimate state leaderships makes it generally more difficult for those leaderships to sustain plausible deniability. This raises deeper suspicions of intent while concurrently undermining trust and possibility of negotiated settlements. The Russians accuse the Americans of interfering in the Ukrainian elections, and the Russian national elections themselves, the use of cyber warfare against Iranian computers involved in nuclear development and the Obama administration. These are the kind of issues that are creating this tension and animosity between the sides. So my point is that hybrid warfare contradicts Clausewitz's fundamental dictum that political communications must not be stopped by the war itself. The danger is not merely that states are adopting tactics of anti-state terrorist movements, but as both Russia and China begin to assert their regional and global interests versus the US, NATO, EU, and Japan, clashing major power interests are beginning to interface in the ongoing war on terrorism. We already saw near clashes between Turkey and Russia, the US and Russia, Iran and Israel, real or actual clashes that could spark a larger confrontation in just the past 2 years. Without just yesterday, Trump stated his intent to drop out of the INF Accord as the macro strategy of political warfare in response to the deployment of the Russian intermediate range systems, and ostensibly to the fact that the INF Treaty does not impact China's missile systems. China was kept out of the Accord, of course. The original version of the INF Accord was going to leave missiles in Asia to counter China. That was wiped out because it was feared that those missiles would be brought back to Europe at some point, and so Gorbachev and Reagan decided to just wipe out all intermediate land-based missiles. But then the U.S. used sea-based missiles in the Bosnian War in 1995, and even though, well, I don't know what we need land-based missiles for to fight China because the sea-based missiles are there. So on Russia's part, Moscow claims it is not in violation of the INF agreement and points to U.S. missile defense systems in Europe that could theoretically be used to launch the first strike. So the claim and counterclaim doesn't end. This, what I call the security dialectic, continues to generate itself, and hybrid warfare simply makes it much worse. And what we need, if we want to prevent World War Trump, is totally flexible. We need to engage in force, and we go back to the last one. We need political, economic, military tools that press for sanctions and other constraints, but at the same time, we need to begin to forge incentives and alternatives to change Russian behavior and action. And this means a proper mix of sanctions and concessions. Now, I mentioned this is one possibility. Earlier it was said both Georgia and Ukraine in 2008 were listed. U.S. press said that NATO will make them members of the alliance. NATO has to draw back from that and begin to look towards ways to create a formally neutral and decentralized Ukraine, for example. That's the fact that Ukraine became independent. It declared neutrality, and yet the rivalry between the two sides has created the war that we're in right now. But without this continuation of political communications, in accordance with Clausewitz's theory of political warfare, we will be in the ruin of the major problem. Not too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gardner. So we'll continue. continue with Professor Zika Turk from University of Ljubljana. You will lead the presentation today?
Yes.
With some more accessible technology. So, Professor, you have the floor. You're talking about disinformation as a political weapon. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I will speak about disinformation in general, so not so much disinformation in international relations, not so much about disinformation as a tool of war, but disinformation as a political weapon in mostly what are domestic policies. And what I will be trying to say is, yes, disinformation is a political weapon. It was and it will be in the future. Nothing new about that. What I will try to say is that it's not so much about disinformation, that disinformation is just one of the tools from the toolbox of a wider effort which is called influence operations, which is probably part of the hybrid warfare. What is new is that internet changed a few things, but my claim is counter-narrative, that disinformation, fake news, and all this panic that we have been living in since 2016 is not such a major issue as some would like us to believe. And they have good reasons why they would like us to believe that. It is one of the tools of influence operations, not the most powerful ones. Influence operations are about trust, and it is trust, not truth. The difference between information and disinformation is whether it's true or not. It is trust versus not trusting. That is the focus of influence operations. And you could do it in truthful means as well. And I would conclude that, yes, disinformation can be stopped. There is technology out there. There are some legal means to do that. But may it be, can we do it? Would that be aligned with our democratic principles? Or what measures would be aligned with our democratic principles? And of course, influence operations which state actors, political parties want to engage in and be successful with. Influence operations can be successful without disinformation, without fake news. Let's begin with what has actually changed. Why is the current communication and media environment different than it was before? Let's look at the news or the information process, or how things happen. I thought that I will be able to handle this, and no matter where you point, it doesn't work. So, Professor, you had a sincere problem. It wasn't you. So how it happens? You create a new story, then you quality control it with some editors, with some proofreading. You publish it. You then amplify it. You put it at the top of the newsstand, or people start talking about it, or you create advertising about it, and then somebody consumes that news. This is what is happening. If you would do this schematically, that would not be so stupid, but okay. Seems now I have the other hand. So the traditional news process would go from left to right. You would create the information here on the left-hand side of this slide, in this area, and then you would have this part which the editors, the journalists, the political parties, and the politicians like very much, because you would control the whole process through the edit, publish, amplify kind of stage. And in the traditional news process, the editing would be concentrated, the publishing would be concentrated, the amplification would be more or less concentrated, and then you would have the consumers, of course, consume that news. And if you would control this process here, you would basically control your media environment. Okay. Maybe I should, if you could put it here, and I could use the buttons. So enters the internet, and on the internet, as people in this room are tweeting and blogging about this event, anyone can publish, anyone can amplify, anyone can like, anyone can boost the news and the information, anyone can edit it, quality control it. Editors are gone. In that last scheme, there was no trash can. You could say internet is one huge trash can of information. There's no difference between trash and non-trash. So, no more gatekeepers. There is a huge kind of chaos in the middle of it. And the key issue of the fight against fake news, the fight against disinformation is, can we, from this chaotic picture here, would it be possible to go back to this? This is beautiful, this is what we control, this is what we can take the grip of. And here we are powerless. Can we get back to the previous one? And, well, there are ways to do it. But what I will argue in the next few slides is that the problem is actually not as bad as we are led to believe. Probably you heard this story that, and the research, these are solid figures, it's just a matter of interpretation, that actually the social media is the main driver of disinformation and of fake news. You would read statistics that 10% of the readers of top news come to top news sites, come to CNN, come to Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung through social media. But 40% of the traffic into the fake news sites come from social media. 10% here, 40% there. Social media is really, really bad. But if you put that into the perspective of the size of the audience, the two charts, how much top news are people reading and how much disinformation are people reading, on this chart it is drawn in scale. There's actually still a lot of people who read top news and rather few people who talk and follow the so-called disinformation. Indeed, fake and real news are discussed a lot. Fake news, disinformation is discussed a lot. It is discussed as much as real news on the social media sites. This may be scary, but actually how much people are consuming and reading disinformation versus information is still very much favorable to real information. And in Europe, it's even better. It's an interesting take out that Europeans seem to be much more resilient to disinformation than the Americans. In Europe, the discussion even on social media about around a particular election was 6-1 in favor of real news, while in the US was 1-on-1. The discussions about fake and real news were equally presented. And this difference, by the way, is replicated in many different European elections that took place over the last year. For example, in the French elections, it was 10-1. Discussions on French social media in the last French elections, 10 times as much discussion about real news than about disinformation. The actual audience size, real news size readership on the left-hand side of the screen, and then the long tail of the disinformation sites on the right-hand side. So people still read a lot of the real news, and you have there under the fake ones also some Sputniks and those who you could call as foreign information operations. So its reach of fake news is about 10% of the reach of the real news. If you want to have somebody to blame, and if you want to have the bad guy in this disinformation discussion and about the spread of the disinformation, then this would be Facebook. So most of the traffic into these disinformation sites and into fake news is coming from Facebook. This is statistic just about one of the fake news, but this is not the major problem that we have with social media sites. I think a lot of people here are on Facebook. If you're not on Facebook, you may be on Twitter, you may be on LinkedIn. So you are on one of these sites that offer you a stream of events that you should be interested in. So, typical Facebook page over there. And the interesting and the dangerous and the scary part is that Facebook is deciding which 10% of all the news do you see. We see 10% of what our friends and what people that we follow and that people that we like have published. We see 10%. We have time for 10%. Facebook decides which 10%. Not Russia, not the Macedonian hackers. Facebook. When Facebook chose to remove news from feed, it was cutting 10% of the real news traffic, it was cutting 40% of the fake news traffic, but both were unhappy about this. How Facebook decides this 10%, it's not entirely clear. It's actually good that it's not entirely clear, because then hacking Facebook, then writing news in such a way that they would come up to the top of your stream on Facebook would be even easier. So we don't exactly know how this is happening. The algorithm is changing. There are people who will be complaining that it is hostile to them. For example, the right-wing politicians, parties, publishers in the US have been complaining that the last change of Facebook was affecting, you see down there, the right-wing sides were very much affected, and the liberal and the neutral ones not so much. So it can be a constant kind of mistrust, distrust into what people see on the internet. And this is the key impact, the key factor that Facebook and similar sites have on the world. They decide, they choose the 10%. And this is, I think, when you speak about information warfare, about influence operations, about fake news, disinformation, etc. This is the elephant in the room. This is the big story. Who decides what you look at? Is he or she, or is that company deciding it in a neutral and an impartial way, or are they trying to follow somebody's agenda? And I'm not saying Facebook is following anybody's agenda. They are being blamed that they were helping Trump, but they were just played. Their algorithms were played by everybody, including the Trump campaign. Some disinformation about disinformation. Yes, it is a weapon. Yes, disinformation is a political weapon. But according to several studies, and I know that it is much more popular nowadays to say that it's a big problem, that it's a bigger problem. But there are studies in peer-reviewed scientific journals that would tell you that disinformation was affecting the election results. This is a quote from this study of elections in the US, by an order of 100th of a percentage point. And you have to read the whole paper how they came up to this conclusion, but the citation is there, and the source is there. Is disinformation a political weapon? Of course, disinformation is a political weapon. Political language, and this is a quote from George Orwell, political language is designed to make lies sound truthful. Lies sound truthful. This is fake news. This is the very definition of disinformation. Murder respectable and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. This is political language. This is business as usual. There are just new technologies out there. And people say, oh, but if only people knew, if only they knew the truth about the consequences of Brexit, if people only knew the truth about Donald Trump. if people only knew the truth about these stupid social democratic policies, if people only knew the truth about these stupid Christian democratic policies, they would not vote for any of that. I think that's a fallacy. This is not true. I think they would still vote the same, and the actual consequence of disinformation and fake news is what in the end remains, what in the end people remember is very small. This is a chart from the same paper I quoted already, and they were asking how much people trust this information, how much people remember this information. And this is major news, big stories in this first two columns, second two columns, minor local news, and then you have fake and placebo news. So the researchers invented news that never existed. They were never part of the news stream. Asked Americans, so do you believe that? Do you remember that news? Do you believe that news? And they remembered placebo news. About as much as fake news, about as much as disinformation. So this gives you a perspective of how strong an impact disinformation really has. However, why there is such a huge fuss about disinformation, fake news, the internet destroying the media, the internet destroying policy, the internet destroying democracy? Because in the old system, in the old media system, you would have old media, old political parties. They would work together. You would have the chief editor of some right-leaning newspaper who would work very closely with the right-leaning political parties. Editor-in-chief of a left-leaning newspapers would be working closely together with the left-leaning parties. And they would have this happy, I wouldn't say a monopoly, but they would have carved the media space and they would have carved the political space for themselves. There was no competition. They were controlling the competition. They were controlling the media environment. Now that there is the internet, you have new media, you have new political parties. But the old players are very much interested in trying to suppress that competition, both political competition as well as media competition, and they have created and amplified this narrative of fake news, of disinformation, of hate speech, etc. All in order to bring back, if you remember those two schemes of news dissemination, into that old picture where there is no more chaos, where you can control what is happening in the center. So a lot of it, a lot of the discussion, I'm not saying everything, but a lot of the discussion about disinformation and fake news is to find a scapegoat. To find a scapegoat. Why did we lose Brexit? Why did Hillary Clinton lose? Why are we losing to populists? It's very convenient to say, oh, the butler did it, or the internet did it, or the fake news did it, the Russians did it. It is so much much easier than saying, well, maybe we did not have the best candidate. Maybe we got some messages wrong. Maybe the other guys were better. So, stopping this discussion about disinformation, let me briefly conclude with the topic of influence operation, which is the big, interesting, important topic. What are influence operations? These are operations that trick the audience into believing stuff that they would not believe otherwise, in order that they would change decision to vote, that they would vote differently, in order that they would regret how they voted, and to undermine the trust in whoever was elected. This is what you want to achieve with the influence operations. And truth is actually not a very big part of the story. The influence operation with respect to the election of Donald Trump was a success. We just don't know whether it was the Republican influence operation that actually swung the votes towards Donald Trump, or was it the Democratic influence allocation, which claims that Donald Trump has been elected, well, after cheating and, we would say illegally, but almost after Russian collusion, etc. The result is that the administration has been taken away some of its legitimacy. It's not, the position of Donald Trump is not the same as if he would win the election fairly. And I'm not claiming that he did not win fairly, but this is the end result. And the Russians can be very happy about it, because in the end it is them who benefit. If you have been observing how the Russians denied that they were involved in the US elections, they were not denying, really strongly and really emphatically, because by that they would empower the political position of Trump. They were kind of pro forma denying, no, we didn't do it. To leave some doubt, because they want Trump weak. There are many, yes. There's more than one way to treat people. It became, yes, because of the internet, more complicated than having partisan editors in the mainstream media. Messaging based on facts does not resonate with real people. We are in this room, people with us facts resonate. With the voters, they want emotion, they want something different. Satire, humor, memes are just as effective as disinformation. And we will be seeing, and we are seeing now, if you observe the US election campaign, how much is invested in humor, how much is invested in kind of political show business. Not many lies circling around, not many fake news, not many disinformation, just fun stuff designed to trick voters. The control of the narrative is the key in today's political warfare. Set the agenda, control the news cycle, how the problem is framed. Trust matters. You need authentic candidates, you need authentic communication. And you can do stuff that political parties can do legitimately, what bots and the Russians are accused of, and that is amplifying messages. Real people can go on the internet and like stuff by the politicians that they like. Real people can engage in discussions on the internet, etc. And the good stuff that the social media networks are doing is that they are really trying to create a difference between who are the real users and what are some algorithms pretending to be real users. So let me conclude. In my view, disinformation is a weak political tool. It's a weak political tool. Truth is available about all the fake news. Truth was out there. If people wanted to search for truth, they could find truth. There's no better tool to find the truth as is the internet. There's also no better tool to find lies as is the internet. But if people do not seek for truth, that points to some other issues and some other problems which serious politicians should look into. Stopping disinformation will not stop populists, will not stop populism, but listening to the problems, the grievances that the populists are exploiting will. And probably a very important point, censorship undermines trust as well. Imagine if you have elections and widespread complaints after that election, what kind of sites, what kind of people, what kind of voices were suppressed before that elections. Legitimacy of those elections would be undermined, and of course the power, the legitimacy of the political leadership elected in those elections would be undermined. So it's, one has to be very, very careful with what one does in trying to suppress disinformation and trying to suppress fake news. Technologically, you could do many things to get the good stuff on the internet. The most democratic one is that you install filter. You as a user, you install a filter on a browser, and it will tell you what is fake and what is not. It will not be the government doing it for you. It will not be Facebook doing it for you. You will choose it to put it on the browser, and you will have the evaluation of everything that you browse. They are not so democratic tools. Governments can interfere, but they can't because there are laws about freedom of expression and non-interference of government, so hands are tied. And what is happening, I think, very dangerously, is that gatekeeping, that chart with that cloud that it was out of control. This gatekeeping is being outsourced to the big social, is being outsourced to Facebooks, Googles, Twitters, Apples, Amazons of this world. Politicians are giving huge power to companies who are already extremely powerful, hoping that these companies will, well, help them win elections or at least prevent others from taking the victory from them. So I think you do not want democracy in the hands of, for example, Mark Zuckerberg. You know, this one, should we do it? Should we do censorship? What do conventions say? They guarantee free speech and freedom of expression and non-interference of the government. If there's one thought I would like you to conclude with, to leave you with, fighting disinformation and correcting errors is like bringing a knife to a gunfight. The real fight are influence operations where disinformation is one small element of it. People have been sensibilized about it, worried about it, are aware that there are lies out there on the internet. Other tricks are being used for the same mission. And with that, I would conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. We'll turn now to the fourth and last intervention of this panel with Professor Jonker from University of Delft and University of Leiden on the topic Technology on the Frontier of a Race for Global Domination, Cyberspace, Artificial Intelligence and Robotics. Thank you.
Yes, I think this also works. As a person from technology, let's not fight technology, so I'm happy with the solution that was invented for me, so that I can just use that. To pick up this story of fake news, I think it's a nice bridge to make to artificial intelligence. And what my story will be about is about the power of artificial intelligence, also possibilities for control of artificial intelligence. But before I do that, maybe a little bit about myself. I studied computer science years ago and developed into the area of artificial intelligence since then, with an emphasis on creating support technology and specifically the support of decision making. So on the one hand, I am to a large extent into helping forming a debate in deliberation, helping people argue for or against something. And in the course of the many years that I've been doing research about that, and in particular in developing negotiation support systems, I've discovered for myself, and I'm not quite sure if it's absolutely true, but I have discovered for myself that it helps to think about people's values. I think most of the people are decent, and from that perspective, I think that if you talk to them and understand why they have a certain opinion, if you dig deeper to the roots of their views, you might still disagree, but you also discover that these are decent people, and that actually you can understand why they choose differently from your choice. I'm not sure if that really in the end will make the vote be a different one, but some first evidence that I've done together with my colleague Virginia Dickman, also from Delft, but recently moving to Umeå in Sweden, we've seen that if you ask people to present, say a choice, the first experiment that she did was in canteens, on whether or not in the university in a cafeteria they should provide healthy food or that junk food would also be okay. And you have these obvious camps you can imagine. Some people that are strong believers in healthy food would say it should be healthy food only. And of course there are also strong believers, not so much maybe in junk food, as in, say, a more liberal idea that I can choose for myself, and you don't have to determine for me whether or not I should eat junk food or something else. Well, if you let people first vote, and then let them talk a bit about these underlying values, and you let them vote again, we saw that there is at least an interesting subsection of the people that suddenly says, okay, maybe not only health food, maybe also some junk food is okay, because people can indeed make their own decisions. So yes, also that has a certain influence, and it makes me wonder what my job is as a person who develops artificial intelligence. And so together with some other people at Delft University of Technology, and also, of course, in other universities in the world, we support the idea of responsible AI. So the long title that was here on the slide maybe could be shortened to just 3 words: responsible AI. I think if we're looking at artificial intelligence, then these are items that hit the news. I'm not sure if they're true. I'm not sure if they're can be trusted. But still, it's news. And it's about 52% of all jobs will be carried out by robots, which is a different one than the stuff that you see at the bottom of the slide, which says that by 2022, 75 million jobs will be gone. Actually, I forgot to look up whether it was EU abroad or globally, but anyway. But that by the same year, 130 million new jobs, but on ICT, would have been created. What do you make of that? Well, it's all, of course, in a matter of how you analyze things like that. For me, it certainly points out that if I'm looking at, say, at least a portion of the people whose jobs will be gone, that they will be unhappy. And it's nice that there will be other people with new jobs, but they would have to re-educate, right? So these kind of transitions also bring some pain, and we have to think about how we're going to do that. Just jumping to a completely different topic is the idea of artificial intelligence as an autonomous system that would be able to interact with us, would be able to set its own goals, pursue those goals, and therefore also be held accountable. Can be given some responsibilities, and of course you can make great headlines with that. If we're talking about truth and trust, then what surprises me again and again is that people believe that the robot Sophia actually can have a conversation up to the level as is portrayed in the news at such meetings. And you feel real disappointment if you ask people when they become aware that actually you would have to send in those questions like a week before, so that in this case Sophia, the robot, can give you succinct answers. So from my point of view, which is from technology, this is a real problem, because time and again people have believed every promise that has been made in the name of artificial intelligence in the last, 50, 60, 70 years. And so far, after such promises, there's always, again, a disappointment. So, now what I hope to do for today is to go over this a little bit with you and to see where maybe the promises that are being made are too high. What can be expected of artificial intelligence, and on the other hand, I'd like you also to reconsider, to think about artificial intelligence as a supporting technology that has great power and that can bring you many wonderful things if you deploy it in the right kind of way. And that's basically what I have in mind. Well, here, for example, it's the AI, the artificial intelligence, which is related to the Internet of Things, and making every electronic gadget that you have a potentially small intelligence gadget, and by combining the intelligence of many small things, you can create bigger intelligence. That's a bit like the idea of the ant and the ant hill. Well, the ant itself might have some limited intelligence, but if you look at the ant hill, it has quite sophisticated intelligence as to organizing where it puts its refuse, where it gets its food from, and has fantastic distributed algorithms for pathfinding that are being used these days in many of the intelligence systems for planning. So there's a lot to be gained also from small intelligence. Okay, and yes, well, it's a bit disappearing from the screen, but about 30 to 40% reduction of energy consumption could be achieved by doing things, organizing things more efficiently together. Okay, so then what is the big hype about? You might have heard it, but the big hype basically comes from breakthroughs in what is called deep learning. And deep learning is a sub-branch of what is called machine learning. So the type of artificial intelligence that is capable of learning from raw data. Now there are various forms of that kind of learning, but one thing they have in common is that they typically learn from big data. And I think many of you will have heard that before. So big data is basically the gold of today, the new material that you can get rich with, and that's true. It's fantastically true, but it also has some risks. Here a bit about the deep learning thing that I would like to impeach on you is the following, that the deep learning is built on an idea which corresponds to some ideas of how our brain is formed. Namely that it consists of a huge network of small nodes, small intelligence, with a humongous number of connections between those nodes, and the neural networks. It's not a new idea. It was already around in the 60s, last century, and by that time it didn't fly. And the reason that it does fly now is, of course, also due to the fantastic efforts of the colleagues from electrical engineering in constructing ever faster, better computers. So, you know, the idea is not new. The scale in which it can be put to work is. And that has indeed fantastic power. It's like really, you know, like a super brain that brings you all kinds of possibilities of extracting patterns from data. Brilliant. Please just keep this kind of picture in mind, that in this way, artificial intelligence with such a neural brain, which has such a deep learning mechanism, could form its own intelligence and therefore in the end set up its own goals and determine its own steps through life. Is that what you want, or is it not what you want, and to what extent can we control that, and to what extent can we do that differently? Okay, so if this is the engine, then the next question is then who is in control? And because on the one hand we hear all these promises, and on the other hand we're being scared stiff by all kinds of movies about artificial intelligence taking over the world and killing us and doing all these nasty things. So in the end, the question then seems to be, who's in charge? It seems like a logical question, but I think we should pose a different question. It's not so much about who's in charge, but how control or being in charge flows from one of us to the next. If you think about how teams work, also between humans, then yes, there might be, say, a head of the group head of the team, captain, and to some extent, if we don't know what else to do, then the captain might decide. But other than that, really good, efficient teams work together in a way where everyone respects each other's capabilities, and everyone also knows that it's limitations. What am I good at, and what am I not that good at? And so, in that sense, control, being in charge, could flow with the context, with the task at hand. Depending on your point of view, we heard a lot about, much more than I anticipated when I came here today, about the elections in 2016. And there was a small voice to be heard on the internet somewhere that said, well, let's have Watson for president. Well, Watson, as you might know, is the IBM computer that won the Jeopardy game, and it's really based on all kinds of fantastic artificial intelligence. A way to give control to an artificial intelligence in the sense that you might wonder about, is this the right point to put a machine in control? I would say no. But before we do that, or maybe to help understand that, is to have a look at what this DeepMind so far has been able to solve. Here you see one of the big breakthroughs, Google DeepMind, based on deep learning efforts, an AlphaGo system. It was basically the first computer program to ever beat a professional player at the game of Go. Well, if you remember that the game of chess has been cracked by artificial intelligence, what was it, in 1998, I believe, where Kasparov was beaten by the IBM machine again. Then, well, this is a major effort. You see, it took 20 years to do that, approximately. But it's still a game. It's a confined game. It's a game in which all information is visible on the board, right? The context is really scoped to that game. And that's the first thing that you should realize. If I listen to all the talks that have been given before me and also the panel of this morning, then the unbelievable amount of background knowledge, of contextual knowledge that you would need to make decisions in this say more real political world are humongous. And that's not easy to solve here for machines like the deep learning or the deep mind tools. Now, let's think a little bit on that. Why is that so? And why would it be difficult to grasp what that thing actually would be doing? And that's, I could demonstrate it maybe like this. I'm not even sure if I could do it. Well, probably with 2 fingers I can easily. I can balance this on 2 fingers. And I could ask you to balance also like a pen. I managed more or less for a while on 1 finger. You can do that probably about as quickly as I managed for a short while here. Fantastic. How do you do that? Can you explain to me how that works? Well, that's difficult. And so when I started my career as a scientist somewhere in the 90s, I was at a conference where this initial race between, say, the symbolic knowledge representation approaches to artificial intelligence first bumped into machine learning, and where it went, there was this story about flying. How can we teach a computer how to fly? So there was 2 camps, and it was a real effort to try and do that. Both camps had the same number of engineers. One camp used knowledge technology, so symbolic reasoning, trying to figure out all the knowledge that pilots would have, write that down, put it in the computer, and see if the thing could fly. And the other one was a team of machine learners, and at that time still relatively simple machine learning. Well, After 3 weeks with full teams of working, full team fully working on the knowledge representation part, the computer didn't fly yet. And they had been asking so many pilots, how do you do that? And all these pilots had so many beautiful things to say, but the thing didn't fly. Okay, it took the machine learners a little bit to set up their program, but basically after working with a pilot in hooking him up to a sensor system to the controls, the thing flew basically within a day. And that's of course power. That's fantastic. And it's really out there. And you can really do that. Brilliant. So what's the problem? Let's go for machine learning all the time. Well, there is this point that we still don't know why it flies. We have no clue. The thing cannot explain it to us. And I think that's a problem. Maybe not for flying an airplane, but yes, maybe it is for making politically heavy decisions about how we're going to deploy all the things, the beautiful things that you talked about, like political warfare and hybrid warfare, and I'm still, shocked by just listening to my previous speakers, because, this is so fundamental what you're doing. It's so essential. Would you really, seriously contemplate of leaving that decision to a machine? It's our lives, it's our society. Don't shift responsibility to something else that can't even explain why it did something. So that was my political statement, I guess. That's my true belief. And, okay, I studied the things, and now what? So, 5 minutes, yes. Just to make a few of the stories about why people are so scared of this. Some people here are saying, from IBM, I believe that AI will eventually establish a new intelligent species. It might be true. A new form of life, who knows? Yes, I think it's possible. Dirk Helbing says, will it then continue to serve humans? Will it enslave us? Or will it be disinterested in us? To which Jürgen Schmiedhuber says, it will be disinterested in us. We don't count. Well, Steve Wozniak goes a bit further and says, well, they want to get rid of the slow humans to run companies more efficiently. Will we be gods? Will we be family pets? Or will we be the ants that I talked about earlier, the brilliant little ants, and get stepped on? I don't know. Well, I don't want to get stepped on, I can tell you. Let's move on to the last thing that I can say here is, why is this so fantastic? I really love machine learning, and it brings so much to us, and it has such a powerful engine. But sometimes you can look at it and you see this big sea of data, and it could be adrift there. It could be adrift because there are biases in the data, there are streams in the data that we are not aware of, and that will basically, you think you're heading in the right direction, and it will bring you to a wrong point. You remember the Amazon story from like a few weeks ago? They applied deep learning to run through all the batches of applicants to the jobs at Amazon to pick out the best 5 candidates, and then basically interview those maybe, or hire them straightforward, right? And wonder, oh wonder, what came out was a biased decision, so they stopped it. Good that they stopped at that point. The reason why it went that way is of course more interesting. What did they give to the machine learning algorithm? The data of the past so many years of how they hired people. Wonder, oh wonder, there was a bias in there. Yeah, I could have told them I'm a woman in technology, so I could have told them that there is a bias in hiring women in technological environments. So what's the problem? Well, why do you deploy machine learning in such cases? Because you don't want to go through all the data, right? But you do have to realize that if you do unsupervised learning, then there might be all kinds of biases that you're unaware of. And well then let's supervise the learning. Let's give it data that we already labeled, like these are good examples and these are the bad examples, and based on that you can categorize, learn to categorize what is the good example and what's bad. Sounds good, but the labeling would then be done by humans with their own bodies, so it doesn't even help, right? So there is not for nothing that we don't want to do all that labeling stuff, and it's way too much work. But even if we did, you know, you would bring in your own problems again. So can we do different? That's basically the question that we need. So how do we stay on course? And so I came up with this, what is happening there? Interesting. Okay. This metaphor to say basically what we need for machine learning is a moral compass. And not just a compass, because you could still drift away with the data on C, and so just a compass is not enough. Basically we need a bit more, which is could be called something like a moral positioning system instead of a GPS system, right? And would tell you where you are in your sea of morality. Well, how do we do that? Well, we're researching it. It's not exactly known to us yet, but let me give you one other parable or metaphor to understand what I'm talking about. And I think you've all seen this picture in some time in your life. There's these people that are fantastic horse riders. If you see the horse as an enormously powerful thing, machine, that can run much faster than we can, and can carry heavy loads, then you see, and it's intelligent, huh? It's an interesting, intelligent agent. If there is like a hole in the ground before it, or an obstacle, this obstacle avoidance will be done by the horse automatically. It's fantastic. It will not just crash into that, it will try to jump it or go around or brake or whatever, but it will do something intelligent. The type of intelligence that we love and that we would like to harvest also from machine intelligence. But you also see a bridle there, right? So there is some steering mechanism, and that's what we're looking for, how to bring that into artificial intelligence as well. So essentially, I think that by research we should try to do the following and say, take all the power from machine learning, the horse, give it a moral positioning system using basically old-fashioned knowledge representation stuff that we can ask what it thinks and why, that we can push on the button to extract the knowledge. Make sure that the system can self-reflect on that, and I'll say a few more words about it. Make sure that we get explainable AI and that we design it for values. So what do I mean if I talk about a self-reflect system? Basically, I would like to have artificial intelligence that can say, hey, where am I on this moral positioning system? What biases am I forming? What's the quality actually of the data that I'm being fed? And who can I turn to for a discussion, for further help, to talk about these possible biases that I'm discovering? That requires epistemic logic stuff from basically also the knowledge representation area. Things that help us ask questions, what do I know? What do I know that I don't know? So those are the known unknowns. Probably you've heard about known unknowns, yes? And of course it doesn't help us yet with the unknown unknowns, but we can do that together. We can work with those systems to help discover that. So for my goal here today is to enhance on you, impinge on you that I'm all in favor of responsible AI, which means that we have to design for values. So it has to be transparent, it has to be designed so that it can explain what it is doing and why. It has to be designed with a moral compass, you know, a moral positioning system for moral control and positioning. And then we can talk about shared leadership, shared control, where everyone takes the best of its efforts for the global good. And the rest is just my personal interest. So that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So we will have something like 30 minutes for discussion, questions and answers. So I invite all the speakers to get on the stage again. you very much for all these very interesting presentations. So, is there any first question? Okay, we start over there. Sure.
Just two questions on the AI side. You mentioned Kasparov. Of course, he did say that had he had access to the database that the computer had, he might have stood a chance of beating it. And of course, we do have access to that database, the Centaur system now. And now we have twice the number of grand chess masters than we had in Kasparov's day. So in that sense, artificial intelligence is really just enhancing our performance, enabling us to be a little bit more ambitious, perhaps than we would otherwise be. Would you say something just about the hybrid nature of what is happening, the man-machine relationship? But the second thing I wanted to ask you about was the killer robots one, because that brings in the moral question. Which side of the argument do you fall upon? Do you fall upon the Ray Kurzweil side of the argument, of the Singularity University, that in fact killer robots, or introducing robots into war, is a moral upgrade, and what he calls a moral demand, because robots will not suffer from the prejudices, fatigue, stress, and biases that we've suffered from in war for thousands of years? Or do you see it as dangerous? Because of course, although that's probably quite true, what you have actually been saying implicit in your remarks is that this is our world that we built. It's not a logical world, it's based on human reason. We make exceptions, we show mercy, for example, punish injustices. We're a very complex species. These systems at the moment are very uncomplex in one sense because they have logical codes, but this is not their world. This is our world that we built for ourselves. And I think that's the real tension in the killer robots debate.
Yes, thank you very much for some very good questions. First about your first remark about Kasparov. Yes, I think if we use artificial intelligence in the right way, we see a co-evolution between humans and technology in the directions that really brings us further, not makes us more lazy and just shifting all the work to others, but using machines to enrich us, to challenge us, to bring us further. And in that sense, yes, I think it's a prime example of what you just gave, so I'm completely happy with it. And if you take that to the next question, then I think in terms of the killer robots, I would be naive to think that all the technology that I personally also work on would be only used for the good, because as soon as you develop something, it can also be used for the bad things, at least the things that I find bad. So yes, of course you can be more selective in your killing, and that might be a good thing. On the other hand, the other people will definitely also use it to more of the killing on who they think would be best killed, and it might be many more than they might kill. So I think there is no way out of that, and exactly at that point I think is where you should put your responsibility away, and you should stand up for what we are and who we are, and say we're responsible for humankind. And we're not going to let machines take over. So no, I'm not going to give the responsibility to the machine to do my warfare for me. But that's a personal stand, and I know that many people think differently. Although there are many AI people that are definitely writing against developing artificial intelligence weapons.
Thank you very much. Second question was here in the scanner room.
It actually wasn't the second question, it was the first question, but because I had the same question, but let me add the sub-question that you touched upon. Design for values, our values. When they start thinking on their own, which they will, because that's the way we'll develop them, how does that move when they start thinking according to their values?
Yeah, so as soon as you start developing for values, then whose values are you developing? First of all, we should realize that all designers also have their own value system, and it's an immediate effect that you also bring those values as a designer to the thing that you're designing. So at least, I'm not saying that we will make it perfect, but we will make it more explicit. And we will make sure that we explicitly talk about what kind of values we develop. And also I'm trying to develop systems or artificial intelligence that understands to some extent what the concept of a value actually would mean. And therefore it's an artificial intelligence that can learn from the value systems of many different people. And we also know, of course, from the difference in cultural values of different nations, that there are big differences between the cultural values that people hold and moral values that people have. So it's not about taking sides, it's about being aware of that there is a value-based system behind it. And the point where I'm talking about a system that in the end knows where to go, knows how to basically scale up to a human authority, is to say, okay, you gave me these values to work with, and now I see a situation in which I have a moral dilemma, and I don't know what to do. And it's not my responsibility in the end to make a choice. And that's nicely put, but if you put it into say an intelligent vehicle, you put it on the road, and there will be situations where the machine is already, traveling at considerable speed, and no matter what it does, whether it doesn't choose or makes a choice, it will kill people. And we know that those kind of moral dilemmas will be the same as humans might face. And for humans, we also have no definite answer. So there won't be a definite answer for artificial intelligence. But maybe to make it very blunt, I would be proud if I were to have developed a, say, intelligent vehicle, or the intelligence in the vehicle, that if it happened to the machine that it would kill someone, that after that it said, okay, not for me anymore, I stop driving. I won't. I'm not sure if I get it, well, I'll try. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. So the first one is about sort of disinformation and use of fake news. And one of the things we've seen in the last few weeks is sort of the British authorities, the Dutch authorities, sort of reporting back on, the Russians, let's say, inability or incompetence. And when we compare that against all this talk about, sort of the Russians manipulating elections, whether it's Brexit, whether it's Trump, the two don't seem to go sort of hand in hand. I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about that. I mean, on the one hand, the authorities have sort of seem to be taking a step away from what they used to do, which is intelligence has to be kept quiet and kept secret, and now we want to sort of put it out in the public domain. But whether this is going, what the consequences of this are, exposing it, but also having this kind of mix between sort of Russian efficiency and inefficiency. And secondly, on the question of AI, I mean, I'm very interested to hear about some of the discussion you made about values and the development of that. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about where state actors currently are in relation to AI. I mean, for example, I've been working until recently in Dubai, where the UAE now has sort of state-level policies when it comes to AI, or at least they're trying to develop that. They like to say that they're sort of at the forefront of this. I wonder if you could say a little bit about this in relation to other regions of the world, in comparison to, say, Europe, America, China. Where does the UAE and others fit? How far down the path are we of taking some of the things that you're talking about, actually putting these into practice?
Well, maybe first about fake
news. About the Russian interferences, etc. There exists a European organization, Stratcon, that is looking at Russian disinformation campaigns and interferences, etc., etc. I was doing a study recently, and I tried to match the intensity of that activity, and was looking for peaks around elections in European member states. And actually, I was unable to find it. What I was able to find is peaks when there was something happening in Ukraine, peaks around the Novichok affair. So it is used very much defensively, or it would appear it is used defensively when their narrative is somehow affected. As to how to approach that, I think a lot of damage has been done with a kind of general and indiscriminative blaming of at the Russians and on the fake news and on propaganda. And I think a lot of authorities lost credibility because of that. There are some EU member states, I would not want to name names, but they have a very good system of, let's say, civil defense, etc. They are monitoring foreign, not domestic, strictly not domestic disinformation campaigns, interferences, etc., etc. And they are giving, kind of specific opinions whether there was some collusion, it wasn't, was there some effect of that or not. And they recently had election in that country, and they seated the members of the secretaries, high-level ranking officials of all political parties that took part in those elections, and said, look, we have been studying this and that, what was going on. We could see that there was some maneuvering going on, but we cannot, we could say that there was no substantial interference into the elections. So if you, whoever will be claiming that you lost the elections or you won the elections because of the Russians, etc., we will claim this was not the case. So establishing such credible institutions that you can believe in, that people can trust, is very useful when you want to fight disinformation and campaigns.
Yes, so from my point of view, I would say explainable and artificial intelligence is essential to understand these algorithms. What have they been checking? What information did they use? How did they make the deductions? So that others can follow that line of reasoning and see if they agree or disagree. I don't think that we will solve the issue that because we have this technology, we suddenly will all agree. It's not going to happen. But at least it will be more transparent. And I don't think that transparency by itself will solve all kinds of warfare or any other conflict. But at least I hope that we're moving with technology to a more advanced state of behavior, in which we realize that that a conflict could be solved in a different way if we all had the decency to look at the different options. And that if we have a global problem, we should solve it together, and not just by one of us killing the other, so to say. I wanted to say something else in regard to your question. How far are we along in this state of reasoning about artificial intelligence and the ethics of creating responsible AI? There are many initiatives at the moment. For example, the United Nations has organized many groups that are talking about charters for the development of artificial intelligence. There are similar discussion groups also on intelligent weapon systems. There is in the EU a high-level group on responsible artificial intelligence, and that doesn't only have, or both groups don't only have, say, the researchers in them, there are also stakeholders from industry and from other societal organizations. So I think at the moment a lot is happening, and we don't yet know exactly how to go, but we're talking about it, and I think that's a major thing, and we will develop those manifests to explain what we think is a decent way of developing artificial intelligence. I can give you links maybe later.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Well, just here on the first row, and then the third one.
Thank you, Robert van der Meulenbroek, former Belgian diplomat. Regarding the Russian implication in the US elections, what we know for now is not very much, and the public at large will probably never know the details. What we know is that 13 GRU officials have been indicted. What we don't know, and that's the crucial question, is whether this Russian emission in the US elections would have flipped the vote. I understand from listening carefully to the exposés that the risk of fake news being absorbed, fake news in general, not regarding the Russian meddling, is rather limited. So if we transpose this to the US elections, would it be limited as well? Do I, or do an American as a voter, need to fear the fake emission in elections anywhere in the world?
If I could answer that, I think part of the problem stems from the lack of understanding how the American electoral system works. Hillary Clinton won by 2 million votes, the popular vote, but only Donald Trump won the election by 80,000 votes in 3 states. 80,000 votes. And if you go to those states, you realize in Michigan, Hillary Clinton didn't go there, first of all. Secondly, in Detroit, they had problems with the polling booths. People, particularly in black and poor areas, didn't have proper access. The punch cards didn't work, the machines don't work. 10 million Americans didn't vote because we're so alienated from the American system of government that they don't vote. And then you have people who voted for the minor candidates. So to blame the Russians on that is a really heavy thing. I really don't think it affected those 80,000 votes. Furthermore, you had Steve Bannon in those states and others who were influencing them. I would blame Steve Bannon on anybody running for Russia. So that's my comment.
Thank you very much. Any comment, other comments on the question? No? So the third row and then the second for the social networks.
From Beyond Horizon. My question is to Professor Markelli. Following sort of the line of questioning and going to the high-tech companies and the AI, where do you see the role of the high-tech companies as non-state actors? I'm specifically talking about not only the Facebook, but Google's and Amazon, the big five of the US, that seem to be getting ever more influential and ever more unrestrained. So I would like to take your take on that. Thank you.
Obviously, I mean, we are moving to a different level of political interaction. And it's a level in which, of course, the digital component is becoming more and more important. So part of national power is directly linked to the ability to develop digital technologies. So in one sense, it's clear that the ability to develop a relationship and partnership with those companies is crucial and will be crucial for the world leadership. And of course, the US is in a very good position, but there are equally other countries that are developing very sophisticated digital technologies with digital companies. And there is, of course, already political controversy, all the sort of attacks against Huawei and others. I mean, this is part of the game. The other issue we should think about is level of the normative regulation, I mean, about cybersecurity. We live in a world in which, on the one hand, we are seeing a redistribution of power, military cyber power, if you want, in a way that does not correspond to the traditional distribution of military power in the world, in which power is more accrued, more concentrated, and in which power is entirely unregulated. Yes, there are little discussions and little sort of proposals to regulate cyber weapons, but as a matter of fact, we live in a world that is almost entirely unregulated. And I think this is a matter for concern, and it is and there are many reasons why they cannot sort of reach sort of an agreement on that. But I suspect one of the reasons is that they are taking advantage of this legal vacuum to accumulate their sort of relative advantage vis-a-vis the others. And I think this should be a matter of concern for all. From time to time we talk about these cyber silos, which and the NSA scandals revealed some of that. I mean, these are, I think, very serious issues. but they are beyond the reach of international regulations, international norms, conventions, and I think, yeah, I mean, to me this is a worry as well. Yeah.
And I would like to make a small additional remark, or maybe two. First is that if you think about big data, then all that big data is these days stored in the cloud. And the cloud seems like a nice abstract concept, but in the end there are big factories placed at some locations in the world where all your data is actually stored. The big companies have most of those machines. If you would like to switch from one company to another and you have all the data of your company with such a big company, then it might take way too long, it might be way too expensive to move to another company because just of the volume of data that you'd like to move. So either you lose the data and start it over, but that sets you back horrible end, or you have to pay a huge amount of money and it takes time to transition the data from one warehouse to the next. Of course, where that data is stored is also important from the legal perspective, where EU regulation is really different from the regulations in other countries, so that's another aspect. And related to that is the energy consumption. I talked a little bit about, using Internet of Things for reducing the consumption of energy. But if we think about all those artificial intelligence, big data computations, that takes a lot of energy. Blockchain was mentioned this morning. Blockchain is taking so much energy that we really have to think also from that perspective whether or not it's good to apply artificial intelligence for everything that we encounter. Maybe we should be a bit more careful about doing that.
When we speak about freedom of expression with respect to these very powerful companies, indeed in all the charters and in the American constitutions and their amendments and the European Charter of Human Rights and so on, there is wording that says, well, governments should not interfere with receiving and imparting information. I think those charters were written in a period where it was inconceivable that at some point private companies would be even more powerful than governments to do that. So I am reluctant to agree to the argument that some people say, oh, but Facebook can do that, they are a private company. Twitter can do that, they are a private company. I think that some regulation should be applied on them, and I like to put that under the label of content neutrality. Some of the Europeans know the concept of network neutrality, which said all the network internet operators should treat all traffic equally, all traffic equally. And content neutrality would ask of these big internet utilities, basically Facebook and the others, to treat all content equally and not try to do political favors one way or the other. I think the direction in which policies are going is exactly the other way. Politics is hoping that these companies will be doing whoever is in charge a favor. And this does not happen only in China and in Turkey and in Iran. It is happening here in Brussels. Thank you very much. So we have now the social networks questions.
From the Beyond Horizon, we have 4 questions coming from social networks, 2 of them for Professor Turk, and they're very related, very close to each other. The first one is, what are your views on the latest trends in democratic countries like US, Poland, and Hungary in terms of use of disinformation and fake news by those holding political power? The second one is a little bit long. Thank you very much for the very interesting and well topic about the use of social media and influence operations by governments and some institutions. It is very well perceived and observed that it takes place, but unfortunately not many people on the target are actually aware of them. I mean the great majority that provides the votes. My question is that what can be done about it? Is there any ideas or way from your side that would be very famous It'd be like the very famous Davis snake back in history that we could take advantage of against these very complicated info operations as weak individuals. I know there is not one size fits shoe that fits all, but I would love to hear your comments on that. Thank you again for your contribution. The other two are for Professor Gardner. The first one is when we look at Taliban, Al-Qaeda and ISIL, those terrorist organizations went from the initial point of local terrorist organizations evolving into transnational terrorist networks. Then the latest change in the evolution, ISIL came as a transnational terrorist network with the state-like capabilities. Do you think after ISIL we will see terrorist states? And last question is, some people call Russia-Ukraine conflict as compound warfare instead of hybrid warfare. In terms of terminology, how can we define it more clearly?
Maybe I start with Poland, Hungary, etc. I'm also a member of the European Commission's high-level group on fake news, which the popular name was that. And one of the findings, also one of the recommendations of that group was that probably one of the better approaches, one of the better tools to reduce the impact of disinformation and fake news is to have a balanced, professional, pluralistic media space where people can get quality information, which is leaning in all possible political directions, but professional, quality, diverse media. And indeed, in some of the countries that you mentioned, there could be some issues with that, but issues with the media space and the plurality of the media space also exist in countries which are never mentioned. For example, there was a huge commotion when the only opposition newspaper in Hungary was supposed to be closed down. In Slovenia, for most of the time, there is no opposition newspaper, except when center-right happens to be in power, then we have only opposition newspapers. So it depends on how you look at that. As to how to make citizens more resilient to influence operations. Of course, there are many things about educating the voters and quality media space, etc., etc., etc. I still believe that the biggest asset, the most important thing is that you let influence operations from different sides, so that people can compare. So there is actually a war of ideas, that there is a competition of narratives. And then somehow I'm an optimist, and I think that in the end the better guys and the truth and whatever wins, if there is a fair competition of ideas.
And may I add? I mean, because it seems to me sometimes there is an overlap that creates serious confusion between the fact that what is illegitimate? Are fake news illegitimate, or is foreign influence illegitimate in electoral campaign? Now, I would agree that on the first, obviously, it's an issue and there are legal issues. But on the other hand, because I heard sometimes arguments about saying, oh yeah, but this sort of social media, but also media influence from abroad is illegitimate during electoral campaign. But I don't really understand what this would amount to. Would you shut down BBC when there are, and CNN when there are elections in Italy? We should not listen to what they say about that. But this is sometimes when you talk about sort of influence campaign, and I heard arguments in the past about, yeah, but even the fact of sort of having foreign influence would be considered illegitimate because this should be a national debate. And it's a very tricky point.
If I may just briefly respond. So I would not go into legitimacy, etc. What I was saying is that I think interfering in information exchange which is domestic is off limits because of freedom of expression conventions and charters, etc. It is not illegal, it is not prohibited by these conventions to fight a war, to fight an information war with a foreign power. I'm not saying it should be done. I'm not saying what the results would be. After all, I mean, we had a long history of Voice of America, which was actually doing it in the other direction. I'm just saying that domestic voices may not be suppressed unless they are illegal, clearly from the hate speech or some other perspective. Foreign can be. Should they be? That's a totally different question. And what the effect would be. Because then you run into the, then people start believing, oh, there's a conspiracy theory. They are preventing that, so they go around it, which on the internet is always possible. And they even more believe the lies that are coming from abroad.
I think there were questions for you.
Yes. First, let me take the last one. First, compound versus hybrid warfare. I wrote a paper on that. You can find it on the internet. NATO, and I compared Iranian influence intervention in Iran after the 2003 Iraq war with the Russian intervention in Crimea and Ukraine. There's a lot of parallels. I prefer the term hybrid because to me it means more multi-dimensional form of warfare. Compound warfare is a mix of overt and covert warfare, and it's still got the idea behind it that it's under control. While hybrid warfare is more multidimensional. Remember, before Russia wanted to assert its hegemony over Ukraine, they tried to put Yanukovych in power in 2000, first election, and then it got him in power in 2010. And then when he started losing power, it shifted gear into covert and some other operations, brought in its little green men, who we call polite men, taking over the Crimea, etc. And at the same time, it engaged in cyber warfare, it engaged in a nuclear threat, it threatened to put tactical nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad and also Crimea. All these things to me are multiple complexes that create unexpected results. It's out of control. So the government, and furthermore, there's populations involved on both sides that get involved in it, kind of like, I think of it more like the 30 Years' War than anything else in Europe. And so the point is that it's all out of control. And it's much more difficult, as I said, to put rational control over it than compound warfare. Compound warfare still had some state direction behind it. And I'm not sure this new situation really is under the control of the different sides. Now, in terms of the spread of terrorism, yes, ISIS is defeated in its way, but actually it's going to become more difficult to, if I understood the question right, be more difficult to defeat because it's going underground. When it was a terrestrial, it became a guerrilla force that took territory. In other words, you could strike it and beat it back and take over its territory. And that's what the United States involved in Syria, etc. Syria has been gradually taking over the territory, and ISIS and the Iraqis have also been doing the same with Iranian assistance. But the point is that now it's going underground, it's creeping back into Afghanistan, it's merging with the Taliban to a certain extent, and globally, the Russians are starting to talk to the Taliban in order to defeat ISIS, which is seen as evil, and work its way in once the Americans begin to withdraw. So the whole political game, and Russia is also making relations with Pakistan. There's a whole new game going on there that I haven't quite seen all not showing all the ramifications. But this will intensify conflict with India. I didn't talk about India today, but we have multiple fronts developing. Be very different than the war once the Russians settle their position in Syria. But that's not settled either because they're worried about what's going to happen in Dagestan and other places. As they attempt to repress Syria, they're going to have a counter reaction that the CIA calls blowback, and the Russian version, KGB version of blowback, relative. It's already happened. There's had a big strike, just a terror strike the other day. So if I understood the question, in my view, we're in for a new phase of this war, even though ISIS is being defeated, and will call itself ISIS, and they call itself another.
Okay, thank you very much. I think time is over now, so we are going to the concluding remarks. So I will ask Professor Strug to get on the stage because...
Are we going to have coffee break?
So the coffee break will be after the concluding remarks. I'm just delayed for 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I will have some general observations of what has been said today. I was hoping that people would be a little bit more optimistic. I'm used to be very cynical and skeptical, so I think my presentation will confirm that everything was said today was really actually very pessimistic. So what's interesting is that maybe you know that the doomsday clock is at 11:58. So that's a little bit worrying because a few years ago she was at 11:54. So it means that yes, things are not going that well in this international system. We have clearly the decline of the liberal order, although probably it's a relative decline. I hear always that it's absolute. I'm not sure that it's apples. I don't think it's more relative. And it starts certainly with the economic crisis in 2008. But what is interesting is that what we see in Europe and certainly in the US is also sort of fatigue of this Western liberal order, meaning that I have the impression that the West doesn't really want anymore to intervene in conflicts and so on. So there is clearly a leadership vacuum. So yes, the Western liberal order is in crisis. It's about institutions are in crisis, norms, values. We see in Europe and US that nationalism is increasing, populism is increasing. That means that there's a weakening of our democracies, and clearly China and Russia are playing an important role in this weakening. And also, certainly concerning China, that is something new since a few months, is also starting to promote its own autocratic regime. Till now it was more on the economic style or the economic view of China. Now it's more and more the political approach that is also promoted against the approach of the democracy. So we have also seen that there is a retreat of democracies. There are less democracies than 15 years ago, so that's also worrying. And we have also seen that something that we haven't really talked about today, but regional wars are back, but also proxy wars. So I mean, Syria is a very good example, but we could also take the example of Yemen, Ukraine, and so on. So the Trump factor in all this is for me only a symptom of an evolution that we have seen actually since already certainly over 1 decade. Of course, some policies of the Trump administration are accelerating clearly the Western decline. That said, we have also external factors that are playing, as we know, of course, the aggressive declining power of Russia that is clearly declining, but more and more aggressive in its decline. And we have, of course, rising powers. Everyone would talk about China and India, but they are not the only ones. We have also states as Indonesia, Vietnam, Ethiopia that are actually increasing. So it means that the balance is clearly completely different than 10, 15 years ago. That means also that most of the states that are emerging do not share our values, culture, or history. And certainly not our Western values. So it's also going to also be a big, big, big challenge for our future. Because they think differently, they manage things differently. That means also that, and I think that most of the speakers this morning talk about it, is the return of power politics. So it's pure realpolitik based on national interests, power, sphere of influences, geopolitics,
More and more geoeconomics, that's something new maybe. We talked about it in the 90s, but we see that today, certainly with China, but also actually the US. It's pure based on geoeconomics. And then the last one, and I agree with what's said this morning, I don't think that the clash of civilizations is a good word, but I think that clash of identities are clearly present. And that everyone, every state, regional board and things like that are completely in a different mindset than the West. So, big challenges for the big powers, and as Organsky said, the exercise of power is an art that needs to be mastered and used advisably, and that's certainly not the case today, not in Russia, not in China, not in the US, and also not in the EU. So we have, I think, a lot of work to do, because clearly the competition between the great powers becomes problematic. And it's not only about China and US, it's about Russia, it's about India, it's about the decline even of Brazil that could bring probably some chaos in South America. So that's going to be a big, big issue. Concerning our position, so the West, we need, I think, rethink great power relations and abandon our standards used till now. We really have to change how we view the world and not think that we are still the center of the world. We are not. I think we were never actually really the center, but we still think we are the center, and I think that's a big, big mistake. And it would be nice that we should change our mind, because it would make things easier to think in the long term. That means that, yes, we should talk with the Russians on Ukraine and Syria, and we should not talk with the Russians on values and norms, because they do not recognize our values or norms, because different identities and so on. But I do think that in Ukraine and Syria, we have some common interests that would be able, and that would make, I think, the relationship between Russia and US and EU clearly better. We should also take into consideration some of the demands of the emerging powers. I think we made the big mistake not recognizing the role of emerging powers in the UN, based on codes and Council of Security, but also at the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so on, where they still don't have actually a lot of votes compared to the West. What does that mean? In the long term, we should have, and this was also said this morning, strategic thinking. Meaning we really, really think we have to think in the long term, and our grand strategy in the US and EU should not remain on autopilot as it has been in the last 30 years. That means that we really need to integrate all the other great powers in an international society based on pluralism and certainly not on solidarism, meaning that we actually would respect national the identity, the values, and so on of other states, and not try to impose our model. That's, if you know international relations, it's the English school that defends this idea. So we should actually abandon our Western liberal order and have a more realpolitik approach towards the world, and in some way a good old-fashioned balance of power, where we make competition and cooperation, because that, I think, is the only way to have a balanced world in the world of tomorrow. Why is that also so important? Because all the new challenges and threats. We have been talking a lot about new threats. So we have cyber, we have food security, we have demography, we have climate change, terrorism, artificial intelligence, resources, refugees, and so on and so on. So there are so many challenges that if the great powers are not able to work together, it's going to be a real mess. So yes, I'm very pessimistic on what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. But we really need to set up the trends. So what is strategic and what is not? What is high politics and what is not? So we really need to establish our priorities. And we still also need leadership. States still are the main actors in the world. But what we have seen the last 10, 15 years is that nobody wants to take the leadership anymore. I remind you that the Obama policy was leading from behind. So it's not something new in the US, although everyone is talking about Trump, but there is no leadership, not from China, not from the EU, not from Russia, and so on and so on. So I think co-leadership or shared leadership would be a good thing, certainly based on the idea of balance of power, and I think that transformational leadership would be probably better than pure transactional leadership as Trump does today. So in conclusion, yes, based on what I heard today, it only confirms my skeptical view of the world in the next 10, 15, 20 years. I apologize for my very, very pessimistic conclusion. Thank you.
So you just want me to come? I have to also apologize for being too pessimistic. I do see some hope in a few things, but not enough to draw us out of the crisis, the existential crisis of global warming that we didn't talk about in this session. I think that's a situation that will fall. It was mentioned in the first session. I see too many potentials for a conflict emerging in unexpected places. I think we are, as Coker mentioned, the global financial crisis. We're heading towards a global financial crisis, no doubt about it. And that's going to create more domestic social conflict. It's going to affect the areas of the world that may not be expected. We just mentioned Brazil a second ago. The situation in Venezuela right now with refugees, the pouring out of refugees in that area, it's going to destabilize the country. But when Venezuela collapses, that means the money that Venezuela pumped into the region will begin to undermine the economies there. That creates drugs, war problems, more mafias. There's a lot of areas that are going to be, I'm not just talking about the developing world, that are going to create more tensions for the major powers, the U.S., Europeans, Russia, China, Japan. I do see some hope. I did see some hope for contact group diplomacy to overcome the UN break in the UN, the inability of the UN to act on Syria and other areas that we've talked about. Contact group diplomacy at least functioned to bring about an Iranian nuclear accord, and then Trump came in and undermined that almost immediately. So that idea of the combination of the major powers working with the UN and anyone else that's involved, that to me is the model that we have to work on when our UN's dysfunctional and other issues. So there, as I said, I did see some hope there. I did see some hope in the COP21 global climate change until dropped aside on that. I did see hope for a rules-based order for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump dumped us out of that too. That in his own interest, that was probably, in terms of containing China, that was probably the stupidest decision I think he could have made. I understand the reason the decision was made. We had pharmaceutical companies and labor unions complaining about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it was designed to create a rules-based order that would counterbalance China. It would set the rules for Asia. Now, Trump's handed the rules for Asia over to China with its massive RCEP market, which will be the biggest market in the world if it's signed, if it's agreed to in November. There's still reluctance among India and other states to agree to it. There's certainly problems with it. And there's also problems in the fact that once it's established and signed, it's very difficult to get out of. So this, to me, on a political economic scale, the RCEP, Regional Economic Partnership, is I put it, a new coast prosperity sphere. Turn back to World War II. This to me will unbalance the world economy. The other point here is India is caught in between, and India's balanced. So I mentioned you have the U.S., Europeans, Japan, Australia, New Zealand forming one fairly solid alliance, though there's differences among them. You have Russia and China forming a new Russia-China axis, with China as the primary actor, not Russia. So Russia's declining, but it's maintaining itself with Chinese assistance. It's trying to develop itself in Asia with this Asian turn. It's linking with Iran that I mentioned in my talk, and that's why it's creating a land bridge for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And that's what Trump wants to strike it, to weaken it, break it up. But if his policies that Bolton has outlined publicly go into effect, and what he's talked about is supporting Kurdish independence, Azeri independence, Baluchi independence. He's not talking about just exploding Iran, he's talking about exploding the whole region. We're seeing Turkey and its tensions with NATO, the European Union, of course, they're historic. They've never been at a lower level. The whole policy that this administration is putting together is a policy of disaster. There is nothing that's done right. And I just, I said I don't want to be too pessimistic. Started out talking about the hope that the UN and the contact groups could come together and so. Trump wants to do, I'll put it this way, he wants to do leader-to-leader diplomacy. So he goes talk to Kim, and I said this in the book World War Trump. At the time, nobody thought he would talk to Kim because it was all fire and fury. But he does, he did, and that could be a positive sign if his work still works its way out. But he's already creating a division between the South Koreans and the United States by the refusal to. He wants to maintain sanctions on North Korea while the South Koreans want to give some concessions to the North to get them on board. That's what my whole theme was about, that why this policy of political warfare, if it doesn't apply diplomacy and it doesn't allow some concessions to the other side, it is just a formula for perpetual conflict. And of course the reports are that North Korea really hasn't really agreed to anything. I understand that they're going to reduce or eliminate some of their massive minefields. But on the nuclear question, they're not going to budge until they get concessions from the Americans. So the myth of North Korea is the only thing good that Trump has, at least in the image, while every other region, I don't see very many positive policy statements coming out of the Trump administration. Well, I can go on here forever, but pessimism make you even more depressed.
Kindly imagine Professor Parker.
Well, thank you very much, and I wasn't expecting to do this before the last moment. I'm going to be quite brief because I think everybody really wants to bring this session to an end. Very good though it has been. Let me just make three very short observations. I always teach my class Aristotle's principle, the only purpose of war is peace. And we've been talking forever about wars that don't seem to be about that. Cyber warfare, information warfare, hybrid warfare. What are these? Are these attempts to undermine an existing order without knowing what to put in its place? Or are they actually perhaps the order which is now in place? There's a term by Lucas Keller, the Oxford Cyber Authority, called unpeace. we've entered an era for the first time in history of unpeace, neither war nor peace. Something that would have been completely unimaginable to Aristotle and indeed to most people after him for the next few thousand years. So that's something that we might want to look at. Is this an interregnum, or is this actually going to be a condition of life for us in the foreseeable future? In other words, we're going to have to live without order. But it's an order of a kind. It's precisely because it's an alternative to a conventional great power conflict. And that, I suppose, might be the best that we can hope for. My second observation is about values and norms. I do think that countries like China that have now returned to Neo-Confucianism and invoke Confucius wherever they can, we have to read Confucius texts. Countries like Russia that want to put Russian people back in touch with what Putin calls Russian values or Eurasian values are countries that can be held to account for whether their norms are actually consistent with the values that they are professing. So I give you an example of the difference between values and norms. The values of Christianity in my country have not changed in 900 years since we erected York Minster, one of the great cathedrals of Europe. But how you live the Christian life has changed enormously in those 900 years. How did the monks celebrate the opening of that cathedral in the 12th century? By burning Jews outside the cathedral gates. How did they celebrate Christianity in the 16th century when there were no Jews left to burn, because we expelled them 300 years earlier? By burning old ladies who were called witches. And then in the 17th century they actually burnt a cat for catching a mouse on the Sabbath day and breaking the law of the Sabbath. And then in 1988, when the cathedral was struck by lightning and a quarter of it burned down, the Archbishop of York rushed onto television to assure the faithful that this was not an act of God. God was not angry with us. It was an act of God, unfortunately, in the insurance industry sense of the term, for which you couldn't allow to be insured. But other than that, here we have a very interesting example of how value systems remain very largely the same, but the norms, how you interpret those values, put them into effect, institutionalize them, has changed enormously. So I think there is a big difference if you're looking at adultery, for example. In some Muslim countries where people are fined, and others where they're stoned to death, and others where there are different arrangements, people kind of live with this in one sense, maybe social ostracism perhaps. The fact is that different societies will evolve in different ways, but they can be held to account for whether this is actually their behavior is consistent with the values that they're espousing, and not judging them by Western values, or even by universal values, but by their own values. And the third and last goes back to artificial intelligence. I suppose we can always create a virtual reality, and as AI makes virtual reality 100% the same as physical reality for our senses, our minds, our cognitive understanding, we can have an international order in virtual reality, and we can retreat into that if we dislike the virtual, the real order. But the note I'll end on is that unfortunately it doesn't always work out like this, hence the pessimism. And I remember Second Life, which wasn't virtual reality, but it was a computer game, but you could live in Second Life if you wished to, as a parallel existence. And Second Life produced the national liberation movement. It was never intended to produce this. The organisers of the game had never imagined that there would be conflict or war in Second Life, only economic competition. People started targeting organisations like Nissan, which launched a car from Second Life, so you could drive it before it was actually commercially available to buy in the shops here, and American Apparel, as symbols of evil globalization. And so this anti-globalization, national liberation movement arose quite independently of the program, and not of the program, but the programs, and declared war on these organizations and started blowing them up. So I'm afraid that even in virtuality, AI is not going to save us necessarily, because we are, unfortunately, as you said, responsible for the human condition. Very pessimistic. As George Orwell, however, did say, since his name was invoked today, even after liberalism had been discredited as an ideology, pessimism would hold the high ground.